Good evening and welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight, it's an important day for the Indian Space Research Organisation. We are one step closer to landing a rover on the moon, with the Vikram Lander separating from the propulsion module that took the lander to the orbit of the moon. On the 23rd of August at 5:47 p.m, India should have the lander Vikram down on the surface of the moon. So in case you are confused, there is the entire mission, that's called Chandrayaan-3. There's the lander which will touch down on the surface of the moon, that's called Vikram, after Vikram Sarabhai, the father of the Indian space program. And then there is Pragyan, that's the rover which will emerge from a hold inside Vikram before it scars the lunar surface. Now we have excellent experts on this show, also the Minister Singh. But at half past the hour, a very important interview. Afghanistan's Taliban government are celebrating their second anniversary of the takeover of their country. The collapse of the international security grid, the pullout of international forces, and the demolition of what was a promising democracy has been one of the saddest international events. Women have borne the brunt of this transition. What is happening in the country is nothing short of gender apartheid. Joining us, a very special guest, Maryam Atash, perhaps the most prominent Afghan voice in the diaspora. She's an attorney and member of the US Department of State's US Afghan Women's Council. She runs an NGO still, somehow or the other, in Afghanistan. We talk about where Afghanistan is today, 2 years after the Taliban came back. But first, the journey of Chandrayaan so far, including what's happened, what took place today, and what's awaited.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Chandrayaan-3 was launched on the 14th of July 2023 from Sriharikota using the launch vehicle Mark III.
Normal.
It reached the moon's orbit on the 5th of August and has since been orbiting the moon. On the 16th of August, the Chandrayaan was put in an orbit of about 153 kilometers by 163 kilometers, and all lunar-bound maneuvers were completed. Today, after the propulsion module and the Vikram lander separate, and that's a process that you can see here in this animation, the propulsion module will continue its journey in the same orbit, having done its job. The Vikram lander will be further deorbited into a 100 kilometer by 30 kilometer elliptical orbit. On the 23rd of August, after the preloaded commands are triggered, the Vikram lander will attempt a soft landing on the surface of the moon. After the lander touches down and the lunar dust settles, the Pragyan rover will be rolled down. Vikram will take images of the Pragyan rover and the rover will take images of the lander. The first Indian selfies from the lunar surface will arrive. The 14 Earth Day planned scientific exploration of the moon will begin. All right, so exciting times for ISRO, India. Remember, 23rd of August, 5:47, that's when Vikram lands on the surface of the moon. Pallav Bagla joins us. We've been tracking the Indian space program, him much more than me, for many, many years now. Annapurni Subramaniam, Director of the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, and Dr. Raghunandan, Director of the Delhi Science Forum. Thank you all very much for being with us. Let's just first bring our viewers some animation of the event that took place today, which is why we are here to discuss Chandrayaan. So let's play out that video, which actually shows this. And what you see is the separation of the propulsion module with the Vikram lander. The Vikram lander is on the left. That is what will get down to the surface of the moon. And the propulsion module with its engines was part of the system which actually got Vikram into the correct orbit. There's going to be another deorbit maneuver. In other words, they're going to lower the altitude of Vikram, the lander, before making that big attempt in the next couple of days. On the 23rd, we know when it's going to happen. Pallav, what's the process or the procedure from here onwards?
Very straightforward. Today, the propulsion module and the Vikram lander are in elliptical orbit around the moon. tomorrow the Vikram Lander is brought closer to the moon in a more elliptical orbit, and that should be a fairly normal procedure for ISRO. They have done that so many times, but after that they will assess the instruments on board the Vikram Lander, then send the commands up from Bangalore to Vikram Lander, and then program it for the D-Day, which is for the crucial day of soft landing near the south pole of the moon. So, and that would be an automated part. That particular bit is automated. Not very much can be done by anybody, because it takes effort to send a signal and bring it back. It will happen automatically, and they have worked very hard to make sure, done enough simulations, enough testing between Chandrayaan-2 Vikram failure and Chandrayaan-3.
Yeah.
And the scientists and engineers at the Indian Space Research Organization are very confident that this time they will have a soft landing on the moon.
Annapurni Subramaniam, what has ISRO changed between the last mission and now to try and ensure that we have a greater chance of success?
Yeah, so the space comes, you need to test, understand, simulate, again test, understand, and simulate. So there is a parameter space within which we know the things will move, and they have added that, and they have gone to larger parameter space where you have more tests carried out, and all the adverse things can be included, and then more and more tests are done. So understanding everything, and also certain type of measurements you can do in situ and make corrections before they land. So these are implemented and tested. So hopefully everything will be within this parameter space. So we see the lander landing on the moon properly.
Mr. Raghunandan, how difficult is it to soft land a lander on the surface of the moon?
Well, it is difficult. If you hark back to the Apollo moon landings, they had to do manual maneuvers. Neil Armstrong had to do it. This happened again later. There were some touchy moments there which required manual steering to get out of trouble. So 100% automated landings are always a bit iffy. In fact, recently, President Putin was supposed to have gone over to the Roscosmos facility to inquire about the progress of Luna 25. And the director there told him that missions of this kind had a 70% chance of success. But I think as far as Chandrayaan-3 is concerned, those odds have been reduced considerably. As was just said by our colleague from the Institute of Astrophysics, a lot more tests have been conducted this time. Some major alterations have been made in the software and the guidance for the landing systems. Particularly, they had extremely tight margins the previous time. They have now been given more wider margins in the algorithms so that there is a greater chance of success, and the software is given more chance to maneuver the spacecraft as it lands. And lastly, I think that they've got a lot more information on the landing site due to the huge volume of photographs and views that they have received from the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter, which is still doing the rounds, which has taken a large number of photographs of the surface, which have all been programmed in to the software. So now the lander knows much better the terrain where it is landing, and particularly the larger boulders to avoid. So I think all the parameters are now in favor. They've also modified the lander's legs, given it greater shock absorbing capability. So I think with all this, the chances of success this time are pretty good.
Pallav, we're going to be seeing a lot of Pragyan, of Vikram, and will we see a lot of the descent being filmed as well?
Not sure. They would probably be filming it, but to be able to beam it back live may be a challenge.
But will they be attempting that?
certainly there are so many cameras both on Vikram and on Pragyan, and remember, there is a hazard avoidance camera on Vikram, which is going to be taking images. First, the Vikram will hover at 800 meters above the lunar surface. Then it goes down further at 150 meters above the lunar surface, hovers there, figures out, takes images, matches it with the memory which Raghunandan was talking about, and then attempts a landing. So, plenty of images would be there. How much of that can be beamed back live, I do not know, and whether ISRO would really want to do that, because bandwidth is always an issue and the mission is always of prime importance. But most important is, if everything else fails, this time scientists at ISRO tell me they have what is called a salvage mode. Once they go in for rough braking, they go in for camera coursing, fine braking, and if things go wrong, the Vikram lander can still land at some point on the moon without crashing. So, there is a salvage mode which they have incorporated for the first time. There is a lot of confidence in ISRO that they would be able to succeed in having a soft landing. And this soft landing is important for India, it is important for Russia, because they also have
future space missions.
And also for future space missions for America and other countries, because South Pole is the go-to destination for everybody, and India has pioneered going towards the South Pole.
Annapurni Subramaniam, what is it that we want to look for on the South Pole of the moon?
There are many things, in fact, and it's like a gold rush, right? So you have to understand what are the ions present there and the minerals present there, and of course water. So all these are important, and many of the experiments which are going on board this mission will give us more insights into these, like all the experiments which are there on the lander and on the rover. And this will tell us about, how the temperature varies. This is very minute things are to be understood as well. There are overarching parameters we need to know. But if you want to take exactly what you want to do, how to extract things, you need to have quantitative measurements. So things like how the temperature changes on the surface, beneath the surface, because the regolith which this fine particles and rocks, the conductivity we do not know. So the temperature probes are there. And we also know that some moonquakes are there. So how do they actually, how much is this, how will that affect the experiments, etc., need to be found out. And of course the mineralogy. So the rover will have two experiments. One will have the laser, one which ablates and measures the volatile components, the volatile elements as well as components. The other one is the alpha particle spectrometer, which actually will use the alpha particle as well as X-rays to actually get to know what the elemental abundance is there. So these are extremely important information, and we'll have a lot of quantitative measures. So these spectra taken from these will be kind of beamed down, and the analysis will be carried out to understand the quantitative measures of what is out there. And these are very important for to start from engineering, feats. How do you actually perform things, and scientifically what do you gain out of it? Understanding what is out there, how it formed, everything actually. So it's a really big thing.
Absolutely. Pallav, the Russians are, their lunar mission is underway. They would be landing their rover, or the lander rather, they don't have a rover, on the surface of the moon pretty much at the same time, right?
Roughly. See, it started off late. They had a direct flight to the moon, unlike India's, which was circuitous. When you have small resources, you want to do things smartly. So we used a smart way of going to the moon. But the Luna 25 lander is supposed to land between the 21st and 23rd of August. India's Chandrayaan-3 cannot land before the 23rd of August for the simple reason India has to use the lunar dawn. Both Pragyan and Vikram are solar powered. They need to have sunlight available as soon as it reaches the lunar surface. So India cannot rush or try and beat the Luna 25 lander. India will have to do it on 23rd. But then Russia and India are good friends. So there is no race like that. It is, and Russia has been India's guru in ways in space technology. So it is both now having a waltz around the moon, Chandrayaan-3 and the Luna 25 both in the moon orbit, dancing around the moon and both wanting to reach to the south pole of the moon. And when two different spacecrafts reach the south pole of the moon, the data which Dr. Annapurni's group will get would be immense to enhance the understanding of the south pole. Yeah. Because Artemis mission of America is targeting to have a permanent habitation, and that would probably be near the south pole of the moon.
Yeah. Mr. Raghunandan, what is next for India after this? I know Gaganyaan, but where does Chandrayaan necessarily lead us?
Yeah, just two things before I get to where we go next. One is, I think we are frequently referring to the lunar south pole, whereas the landing site is more accurately described as the south polar region.
Okay. Because
we are landing at roughly 70 degrees south, and the south pole would be 90 degrees south. So we are not exactly at the south pole, but we are landing in the south polar region, as is the Luna 25, which is also looking for an early sunrise, and that may be the reason why they may land a day earlier, because I believe their landing site sees the sun earlier than the landing site of Chandrayaan-3. In any case, be that as it may, I think the challenges before India going forward are many. I think we would have had a good moon mission. We will have the Gaganyaan mission. There will be missions to Mars later. I think three major challenges I would like to point to. One is that we see Russia and China increasingly collaborating together and developing perhaps joint programs. They've agreed to set up an orbiting station around the moon, etc. There is the Chinese space station here. India, which has still now been trying to carve out an independent slot, may in some senses now become more reliant on collaborations internationally, sure, perhaps with the US, with the International Space Station, etc. The second major challenge, I think, for ISRO is to develop a heavier launch vehicle.
No, and that's you know, I mean, something we look at.
That I think would be very important, because that's one of the reasons why we have had to take this slingshot maneuver
to get to the surface,
which is very good.
All right, gentlemen, I'm just wrapping, sort of interrupting now. No, Pallav, out of time, my friend.
We have an Aditya
mission coming up. We're going to take a
up.
short break at this stage, and we're going to be following this very, very closely indeed on the 23rd, several hours. But we do need to take a short break. But before that, a very special interview that I did with the Minister, Jitendra Singh, the Minister looking after science, independent charge. Here's what he said. Well, joining us now, the Senior Minister Jitendra Singh. It is, of course, a very important day today, sir, in terms of the journey of Chandrayaan. The propulsion module has been separated from the Vikram Lander. How is this a particularly significant event in terms of the overall mission?
Thank you, Vishnu. Thank you for asking that. Of course, every Indian feels proud of this, but yes, you rightly put it. I think what is exclusive from my point of view is that while we look up to Chandrayaan mission with huge amount of excitement, enthusiasm, inquisitiveness, curiosity, but it is not only confined to India any longer. The entire world is looking up to Chandrayaan, also because there are certain exclusive features associated with this. And that has been so right from the beginning of the Chandrayaan series. For example, even though we started off our space journey much after the USA and the then USSR, maybe in 1960s, when they were already on the verge of landing on the surface of the moon, which of course America did in 1969. But it was Chandrayaan-1 which brought home the evidence through pictures of the presence of water on the surface of the moon. And that was an eye-opener for the entire world community, because that then, led them to start asking themselves the possibilities of a human habitat on the surface of the moon, the the compatibility or non-compatibility or the extent of compatibility of a human life being feasible over there now. These were the things which were just stirring our imagination generation after generation. It's a part of fiction, part of literature, part of poetry, a part of our nursery rhymes about, imaginary people living on moon. But here it was Chandrayaan which for the first time prompted us to find answers to these questions which were hitherto part of the fiction. And this time, this mission is going to carry the same agenda further.
And sir, in terms of that agenda, let me ask you a direct question, sir. Give me a direct answer. What are India's space ambitions beyond Gaganyaan, beyond Chandrayaan? What are we looking to do, sir?
So I think, that this evidently places India as a frontline nation, not only in our space capabilities, but also in the terms of our capacity of innovation and technology, which is going to be the basic benchmark and determinant for the future economy of any country. It's going to be hugely possible, and I think we owe it a lot to Prime Minister Modi for having broken many of the taboos of the past. It was he who actually threw open the gates of Sriharikota, and we had during the launching also about as many as 1,000 media persons at a place which was forbidden even from peeping inside the gate. And from the point of Gaganyaan, yes, of course, it will be placing India, reaffirming India's position in that. And if you see overall, if you mean to say what is it going to mean, that India is now being accepted increasingly with each passing day as a very important global player. B, India is looked up with seriousness, not unlike till few years ago. Everybody, rest of the world thought that, these issues like climate change and clean energy and space missions were something which were not very close to India's priorities, or maybe India didn't have the capacity or the capability or the aptitude to address these issues. Here, now we are taking the lead. If it is climate, it's Prime Minister Modi who talks about it in COP. If it is energy, Prime Minister Modi says net zero by 2070. If it is space, it is now, you would recall when Prime Minister Modi visited DC, Washington DC, it was America which put across the invitation that our astronauts should be joining them for the space laboratory missions. So I think now the rest of the world is looking up to India. And this is going to reaffirm India's position as a frontline, not only player, but maybe a frontline leader in the times to come.
Sir, do you foresee an Indian space station? And secondly, do you foresee manned or crewed Indian deep space missions?
Yes, of course. We, as you asked about Gaganyaan, we are already into it. It got delayed, unfortunately, because of COVID by 2 or 3 years. We had to cut short. We had to interrupt the training of the potential astronauts, which was happening at the time of lockdown. They had to be called back from the Gregory Center in Russia, in Moscow. Now it got resumed. So we are now planning first mission, unmanned mission, maybe towards the end of this year or beginning of the next year. And then the second unmanned, which will not be totally unmanned, is the robo mission. We have a Vayomitra, female robo. Because you see, you would appreciate that getting back a human being safe to the earth is as important as sending him into the space. So while we send him, we must make sure before we do that, that we are confident of having him back. That is important from all points of view. So these two initial missions will complete that exercise, will build up our confidence, and this will be a whole of government or whole of a nation approach, because you will have the naval safeguards into that, you will have coast guards into that, you will have the navy functionaries also collaborating in that, you will have the shipping ministry also, and all of them put together will put in these exercise. So we will have that Gaganyaan thing, which I think is something which is not going to, which is going to get inputs which were not obtained by the earlier human missions by the other countries. Even the Chandrayaan-3, for the very reason that it's landing in a virgin area, the South Pole area. Most of the earlier missions chose the relatively more convenient locations around the equator of the moon. So that itself makes it exclusive. So we have actually dared to tread into more difficult terrain, which also gives an advantage in the sense that there is a possibility of water craters being there, and therefore experimenting with oxygen, hydrogen, all those things which are closer to human life, to clean energy, etc., etc.
Sure. Sir, the Prime Minister loves science, doesn't he? And how closely did he monitor today's events? And is he going to be with ISRO on the 23rd of August?
No, I needless to say that Prime Minister is not only monitors, he takes deep interest, he has a natural aptitude for this, and I have no hesitation to say that it's but for him, it might not have been possible to have such a quantum jump. In 3-4 years, there's a huge change of scenario. And the manner today, even as far as the Artemis agreement was concerned, when Prime Minister Modi was there in Washington DC, as far as space is concerned, I mean, it's something like now you are not being treated as a nation which is trying to pick up cues from them. We are now being looked up for cues for others to take benefit of. So this has happened because Prime Minister has not only been personally monitoring, but he has been very forthcoming, and he has shown the courage to take out of, to sometimes break the taboos of the past, to do away with the regulations which could be inhibiting. Because you just see, if you see the pictures of Sarabhai carrying the launcher on the carriage of his bicycle way back somewhere around 1960, you would be amazed how much passion was there in store, how much aptitude, how much talent, but there were no resources. So I think Prime Minister Modi has not only monitored us, promoted us, given us an enabling atmosphere where we could give vent to all our aptitudes which are lying dormant hitherto.
A final question to you. India signed on to the Artemis Accords. That's important because A, we want space for peaceful purposes, and B, we recognize that we can't do everything ourselves. It has to be a collaboration.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, and I think now the time has come when we have to, if we have to grow further, we have to grow in a synergy. The era of silos is over. The age of silos is over. It has to be a very collective approach, a very collaborative and a very integrated approach. And with the kind of stature that India is acquiring, our benchmarks have to be global, our approach has to be global, our parameters have to be global, and our performance also has to be global.
All right. Well, sir, thanks. Wonderful speaking to you. And
thank you, Vishnu. Thank
I'm
you.
certain 23rd, we're going to be having a big celebration by this time or a little afterwards on the 23rd. Thanks very much, sir, for speaking to me. Thanks very much indeed. Afghanistan's Taliban government are celebrating their second anniversary of their takeover of the country. The collapse of the international security grid, the pullout of international forces, and the demolition of what was a promising democracy has been one of the saddest international events. Women have borne the brunt of the transition. What is happening in the country is nothing short of gender apartheid. Joining us now, a very, very special guest. Maria Matash is perhaps the most prominent Afghan voice in the diaspora. She's an attorney and member of the U.S. Department of State's U.S.-Afghan Women's Council. She's been a senior advisor to the Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce and the Afghan International Chamber of Commerce, as I mentioned, and is a co-founder of the Nuristan Foundation, which has provided education and vocational training and rural development in Afghanistan since 1999. It's wonderful to speak to you. Afghanistan is a country which means the world to me, and I can tell you before we start this interview that I was in Bagram and I was in Charikar in 2001, very close to the time when Northern Alliance soldiers walked in. I've been to your country many, many times. I've seen democracy thrive. I've seen women prosper. And to have this conversation in this changed circumstance and this changed situation is utterly heartbreaking for me. But be it as it may, I must ask you this. A UN report from June says that of the 2,000 odd women that they interviewed, 8%, just 8%, knew women or girls who have attempted suicide. That's a huge number. What is the larger impact of Taliban 2.0 on women's mental health?
Thank you for having me on your program and for covering this issue for your media outlet so that millions of Indians can get more information about what's going on in Afghanistan, since it is a neighbor to India. The situation for Afghan women is very dire. There has been some progress with security, let's say, because now there's no Taliban bombing and doing suicide bombings, although there's some other groups still in the country that are actually working against the Taliban. So women have been the primary victim of this, just like they were in the past. And I speak to Afghan women almost on a weekly basis. And many of them, they are very depressed. They have anxiety because they cannot work. Many of them cannot send their girls to school who are under the grade 6. And there are many women who own businesses. Some are still operating them, but those in businesses like beauty salons, they were just closed. So there's an estimated 60,000 more women out of work. So what's happening against women in Afghanistan is un-Islamic. It goes against international human rights laws and against existing Afghan laws. Although the Taliban is not recognizing the prior constitution, they have a responsibility to recognize the God-given rights of Afghan women and allow them to work, to get an education. I mean, it is just preposterous. Even during my grandmother's times, when she lived in a rural area, there was not this type of restriction. So even though, just like in India, we'll have a difference between women in the cities and the rural areas because of lack of access to education or some resources, it's still, this is not part of Afghan culture, and it needs to be changed.
If we talk about healthcare, Taliban laws state that women can only receive healthcare from other women, something which has severely curtailed, the access of women getting the quality healthcare that they require, because women are now barred from education beyond grade 6, and therefore they cannot possibly study to become doctors anymore. So just access to basic healthcare it's difficult, if not impossible.
Yes, this presents a tremendous challenge. Afghanistan already was needing to progress in the medical care field. Most people for complex medical issues were going to Pakistan and also India. And now you have them, it's very difficult for them to travel to those countries, and they're relying on women in the country to provide that care, which has decreased greatly. So yes, Taliban say that these are temporary suspensions, but it's now been almost 2 years. When is this going to change? This is going to create a brain drain inside the country. You cannot take 50% of the population and suppress them like this and expect for the society to grow. So women, unfortunately, will see the brunt of this because they will have less access to medical care. But eventually, it would affect the entire Afghan population. That is why we need the international community to engage with the Taliban, to push for a more inclusive government, to push for a government that includes women again, and to lift these decrees. If the Taliban want this recognition, managing a government is going to require this accountability to the Afghan people. And this is where the Indian government, the Indian people can play a role. Don't look at Afghanistan just from the lens of Pakistan. Yes, the Pakistan ISI has been supporting the Taliban from day one, but we need other countries to provide people-to-people assistance, including in medical care, and to look at the economic possibilities. If Afghanistan is stable and prosperous, India will prosper. India used to be and probably continues to be the largest consumer of Afghan dried fruits and nuts. There was an exchange of business people between the two countries. So I think India can have a role here in medical care for the short term. Allow more visas for especially women to come to India for medical care, but to put pressure on the Taliban government to change these policies.
In fact, that link with India, and I was going to talk about it, it is really profound. One of the most prime basic children's hospitals in Afghanistan, in Kabul, was an Indian one. We helped with the design and construction of your parliament. One of your first elections, I remember I was on the ground. The Election Commission of India helped to conduct or gave advice, etc., etc. The Afghan people and people in our country are extremely close. That is an incredibly solid bond, isn't it? And isn't that suffering as a result of the change that we see on the ground?
Yes, you are absolutely right that there is a shared history going back from the Mughal empire. We have a shared love of music, food, culture. Afghan people love Indian films. A lot of the Khans, they come from an Afghan, ethnic background. And Indian people, they loved Afghan food and music. And I think that shared history and that shared admiration cannot be broken by one political group. While the Afghan people are suffering, currently, in many ways, they still have their access to different countries and cultures and their opportunities. And I think the Indian people should not forget about the Afghan people. They are your brothers and sisters in the region with this shared culture and history. And I think it was a positive one. The only thing that I think we still have to improve is that politically, the Indian government has seen Afghanistan from the lens of Pakistan. I think there should be a direct political, economic, and cultural link, and that link should not be broken by any political group.
You forgot something we both love as well, cricket. It really binds people. And Afghanistan is such an incredible cricket power now. And it's such a new cricket power, but it is a shared love. But let's talk a little bit more about the status of women. And I ask this because is there any real legal recourse anymore for women in Afghanistan? Studies find that women lawyers' permits have largely been cancelled. When they complain of domestic violence, they're often told that they deserve this under permissible Taliban law. So there is no legal recourse left, is there?
The Taliban have their own version of providing justice. In some ways, they've been able to reduce corruption. And one of the only positive effects I can see is removal of the prior failed leadership and warlords. But what are they replacing it with? And now it's on the Taliban and their responsibility to provide justice for the Afghan people, and especially for women. If you're going to take away the licenses for women to practice law, there's not any women prosecutors and judges. Yes, this goes against Afghan history and culture. Women need to be in those roles, and women deserve that access to justice. It is correct. There were problems with that before, and those problems have now increased because of this lack of access to justice.
Mariam, according to you, how have illegal activities with the Taliban coming across, like child marriage, forced marriage, child trafficking, domestic violence, has this actually gone up?
Well, there's not a lot of good reliable reports because of the lack of access for information. Most of the reports are coming out from the United Nations World Food Program, mainly on humanitarian crisis. But there have been some organizations that continue to work in the country. Now, we should present a balanced picture. There has been a positive impact on reduction of the poppy trade. That has gone down significantly since the past. But these other issues, for example, the forced child marriages, some people are saying, oh, okay, this is for economic reasons. This is why this has been done. But there's also reports that certain members of the Taliban are forcing women to get married without their consent, which goes against Islam. So yes, these problems continue. It's something that Afghanistan needed international assistance with. It was still trying to rebuild, in 2021, and now we have a new group that has taken over, and it's quite hard to manage these issues. There's some sanctions. The government is not being recognized by most countries, and so this made these problems and issues more dire. This is why we need more international assistance and engagement in Afghanistan, not less.
Are you therefore encouraged by the fact that despite having so many differences, obviously, with the Taliban, the government of India has tried our best to actually reach out because of humanitarian, the humanitarian crisis at so many levels? When it comes to food supplies, it means transshipping food to Afghanistan, which is difficult because of the presence of Pakistan in between. But on occasions, we've been able to do that even through Pakistan, through other ports, Chabahar, for example. Are you therefore encouraged by the fact that India is being pragmatic in dealing with the Taliban?
Yes, I think that we cannot hurt the Afghan population for choices they did not make. The Taliban is a small group. Unfortunately, they do not represent the ethnic diversity of Afghanistan, and they obviously do not have any women in the government. But during this time, there are transition times like this. I believe that there has to be change because this is not a type of system that people can live under long term. Yes, countries like India, the Afghan people greatly appreciate that assistance during this time where they have gone through this political change. They were not ready for the U.S. complete, not just withdrawal of troops, because in 2021, there were very little, if none, combat American troops. What President Biden did is remove all the assistance to the local security forces, and that created this power vacuum, and the Taliban came in and filled it. And so the assistance of India and other countries to provide humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people directly doesn't have to be given to the Taliban, but you have to work with the Taliban because they're the ones that are there now. And people should understand that, in 2021, there were 20 million people that needed food assistance, and that increased by about 10 million just in 2 years. So the Afghan people are suffering. They need this assistance. And I encourage the Indian people to support this for their brothers and sisters in Afghanistan. Afghans are very proud people. They don't want to rely on foreign assistance. There's trillions of dollars of minerals in the country that China is looking right now to invest in. And we need other international partners who see the Afghan country as a place to invest in a good way, for the benefit of the Afghan people and those other foreign countries.
Could you tell us or share accounts of families which have been separated? Afghanistan is almost completely cut off. Getting into Afghanistan, getting out of Afghanistan now is extremely difficult. Would you know of many families which have been separated over the last 2 years?
Yes, I practice immigration law in the United States, so I'm representing Afghan families who have immediate family members. The United States was supposed to have programs to help reunite this population of people, and that has been very slow because the United States is relying on flights that are controlled by the Taliban currently. And there are some flights still going and operating out of Afghanistan. What's really surprising about Afghanistan is that through so many different conflicts, the Afghan people find a way to get things done through the private sector, whether it's trade or even travel. It doesn't really stop everything. And so we still have flights. People are going in and out of the country, not at the same levels of access as before, but that at least is promising. But yes, many families have been separated because of visa issues. They're just not able to enter third countries and come to the country where their other family member is. And I encourage the Indian government, your government has had an emergency visa for Afghan nationals, which has been very helpful to allowing some Afghans to go there for a temporary period of time until they wait for their refugee cases to be processed in other countries. This allows people to be reunited with extended family. I mean, this goes back to the 80s. I've had family who lived in India in the 80s who were there for a few years of time before they came to the United States or Europe or Canada, wherever else our family was. So I encourage the Indian government to continue supporting that and to increase that, make that easier for Afghan families. And the United States and other European countries have not fulfilled their promise of relocating and resettling Afghans who were affected by this crisis.
Mariam,
they promised, they said, you are our ally, and
yes.
They're not here yet in the U.S.
Tell us a little bit about, your own family back in Afghanistan. Have they primarily resettled elsewhere? Do you still have very strong family links? Are you worried about your own relatives?
I still do have some extended family who are in Afghanistan, mainly cousins, because my family was in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion, because my grandfather was a 3-star general who opposed communism. That's another part of history people forget, that the Afghans fought against communism, and that risk did not come into their country because of that sacrifice. So most of my family immigrated to the United States because my father was studying for his PhD in the United States at the time. They went to Canada and they went to Europe. So my family ended up being dispersed around the world, but most of us ended up being able to come to the United States. But I still have cousins and people that I'm trying to help. I have extended family where the women are not allowed to go to university, and we're trying to find ways to support them to get online education. So that part is really tragic because the suffering is still close to your heart, and you see the impact of it. But we will not stop. We will continue doing what we can to assist not only our family, but other families in need.
The Nuristan Foundation, of which you are a co-founder, continues to work even now. How do you manage to do that?
Well, our foundation always worked with local partners because we now are Afghan diaspora. We did not want this image that we were there to tell people how to do things. So we always worked with local partners. That's what we continue to do. We actually work with a women-led NGO. She's still able to operate. She's an amazing, courageous woman who continues to operate a program that we have to take children off the street and into the classroom, and for women to get some training in the design sewing field for now. These are small programs, but they're making an impact in the lives on a couple of hundred of families. And many organizations, they still have their licenses to operate as a nonprofit organization. This is still allowed under most countries' laws, that you can still work in the humanitarian assistance field in Afghanistan. So that's how we're able to continue our work.
Is it your concern or your worry that over a period of time the situation in Afghanistan will be normalized in the minds of people around the world? We can keep talking about it, but it's a new normal which people just have to accept because there doesn't seem to be an alternative, and that therefore represents perhaps the biggest concern, because unless there's an active effort at helping the Afghan people, then that new normal might just become a reality.
Yes, you raised a really good point, and unfortunately, this has already been happening. The United Nations is not putting as much pressure as could be possible in this situation. And neighboring countries still need to be engaged in putting pressure on the Taliban to form an inclusive government, because without that, the Afghan people will not feel that this government truly represents them, and they need to work with them to put pressure to remove these un-Islamic practices. There's a lot of Muslim countries that have issued statements, but they're not taking as much action as is necessary. And it may not be maybe their country's problem for a certain period of time, but if we look back at history, if then things get worse, it will eventually affect regional and then global security. So it's not something that we can ignore.
Mariam, is the ISI at one level running the show in Afghanistan?
Well, I think people may have seen the pictures of the ISI
Yes.
chief having a cup of tea in the Serena Hotel right after the Taliban takeover. So I think sometimes a picture speaks 1,000 words. Where were the Taliban during the last 20 years? Where were they training? Where were they located? It was with the support of Pakistan's ISI. There's many reports out there that verify this, that people can look into. And there's this issue of the Pakistani ISI seeing Afghanistan as a place where they want to kind of control the politics because of this old Duran line issue. I think the Afghan people, we're moving forward from that. Boundaries and borders don't matter if people are starving and they don't have food and they don't have trade, they don't have people in school, they don't have, as you said, access to medical care. So this is the problem that we have. In a way, the United States subcontracted the issue of Afghanistan back to Pakistan, similar to what happened in the 1980s. And I just don't see that as being sustainable. And the new great game that is now happening is that we have China, Pakistan, and the Taliban cooperating more economically. And I don't think that that is something that is good for regional security or global security. And remember, Afghanistan has trillions of dollars of minerals, and this is what the Chinese are really interested in. And so the world should look at cooperating with Afghanistan to help its economy, so it's not just this triangle working there, because that will be an imbalance. Whenever you have an imbalance of power, something then can happen that can create greater instability in the future.
And a final question, it's not as if with the Taliban being in power, terrorism or attacks have actually come down in Afghanistan. There are different groups, ISIS, I believe, operating as well. There are various dangerous groups still out there. People continue to suffer as a result.
Yes, this is something that is very interesting because there still have been suicide bombings. There are some other groups like ISIS-K, and whether they call themselves Al-Qaeda, there are other groups that are even more extremist, militant, and we need to look at where are they getting their support. And they are still trying to create these problems because they want their even more extremist view of taking over Afghanistan as some type of terrorist hub operation, which they see still has not happened. So it's not a very simple picture of just Taliban and that they're all on one agenda. We still see some of these other fringe groups committing terrorist acts against the Afghan people. So now, very ironically, the Taliban are dealing with a similar problem that they were part of in the past. And so this, again, will affect regional and global security if the world community does not take a greater role in finding solutions.
And I have to ask you one more question because it just comes to mind. What happened to leaders like Amrullah Saleh? What happened to several of the leaders who fled Afghanistan at that stage? Do they have any political capital left? Can they be part of a movement to bring about change, or is that over? Is that not going to happen?
Well, I think your audience is quite sophisticated to understand that right now the Taliban are not really being recognized. And what we have is a very kind of unique situation where we have a government in place that is not being recognized by most countries around the world or by the United Nations. And then we have ambassadors from the prior regime sitting in embassies around the world, still carrying out consular functions. And the passports that they're issuing are being recognized because Afghans need those passports to be able to resettle, and passports being issued by the Taliban are being recognized. So you almost have this fringe government still operating outside the country. But I would say that it was the failed leadership of those individuals that led to the problem that we see today. The high levels of corruption that existed, and the international community in some ways, through the contracting, were part of it. And the Afghan people do not want those leaders anymore. So India and other countries should not be talking to prior failed leadership. It is insane. It is just going to lead to a worse situation because they have lost the trust of the Afghan people. So people would say, okay, what's the alternative? I would say that there are many Afghans, whether they're tribal leaders, young leaders in civil society that are clean, honest, they want good for their people, and it's time for the world to work with them, support them. These prior failed leaders will come and sell themselves as the solution for Afghanistan, but obviously they did not succeed, and now a new generation of leaders should be supported.
Mariam, it's been wonderful speaking to you, and of course we think about Afghanistan here each and every day. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.